What's up, fight fans? This is Kurt DeVille with Counterpunch Boxing News, and I have some new news, some breaking news concerning Saul Canelo Alverez. Get this. Tom Brown from the PBC states that we offered Canelo Alverez $45 million for Charlo, $55 million for Spence at 64, or Benavidez at 168. Wow. The first two fights of Canelo Alvarez's three-fight reunion with DAZN and Eddie Hearn's Matchroom Boxing were revealed earlier this year. If the Mexican icon defeats Dimitri Bivol on Saturday night at T-Mobile in Las Vegas, Alvarez will move back down from 175 division to 168 limit for his long-awaited showdown with rival Gennady Golovkin September 17th at a venue to be determined. A third pay-per-view fight against an unknown opponent would conclude DAZN's new agreement with Alvarez. What wasn't been revealed until now is that the exact offer from Al Haymon's Premier Boxing Champions and Showtime that Alvarez turned down to accept DAZN's deal, including the options of pay-per-view fight against undefeated welterweight champion Errol Spence Jr., Tom Brown, whose company TGB Promotions represents Spence and Jamal Charlo, informed BoxingScene.com that PBC offered Alvarez a $45 million guarantee to fight Jamal Charlo on Saturday night, and if we would have conquered Charlo, a $55 million guarantee to fight either Spence at a catch weight of 164 pounds or David Benavidez at 168-pound limit. His fights against Charlo, which is 32-0 with 22 KOs, and Spence is 28-0 with 22 KOs, or Benavidez, which is 25-0 with 22 KOs, all would have been contested for Alvarez's IBF, WBA, WBC, and WBO super middleweight titles. Golovkin, the IBF and the WBA middleweight champion, also would move up to a 160-pound division to challenge Alvarez for his 168-pound crowns if Alvarez beats Bivol. Alvarez's combined compensation for Bivol and Golovkin fights is believed to be comparable to what his guarantees would have been totaling for the Charlo and Spence or Benavidez, but Brown believes that Eddie Reynoso, who manages the trains Alvarez, encouraged the four-division champion to take a path of lesser resistance versus Russia's Dimitri Bivol. He's 19-0 and 11 KOs. And Kazakhstan's Gennady Golovkin, which is 42-1-1 and 36 KOs, who turned 40 last month. Props to Eddie Reynoso, the manager of the year, for getting Canelo these huge paydays with the least risk, Brown said. He had him take the least risk for the most reward because he had a chance to fight a reigning champion at 168 pounds in Charlo, and he also had a chance to fight an undefeated two-time former 168-pound champion in Benavidez, or he could have fought the reigning welterweight champion. It was a $100 million deal. DAZN streamed each of Alvarez's 6 bouts before he aligned with PBC and Showtime for his last fight, 11th round stoppage of the IBF, or former IBF, champion Caleb Plant on November 6, that made the Guadalajara native boxing's first fully unified super middleweight champion of the sport's 4-belt era. Multi-sources informed BoxingScene.com in November that Alvarez Plant produced nearly 800,000 pay-per-view buys. The 31-year-old Alvarez victory over Tennessee's Plant marked the first time Alvarez fought exclusively on a traditional pay-per-view platform since his 12-round majority decision defeat of Gennady Golovkin in their middleweight championship rematch in September of 2018. I'm going to stop there, people. Let me counterpunch. $100 million. 55, 45, 100. That's what that means. Sure. Okay. What they're not talking about is what did Canelo make from this deal? Gennady Golovkin and Dimitri Bivol. One's at 175, the other one's at 168. He's reigning undefeated champion at 168. He could have fought Errol Spence at 164, which he did before he fought Julio Cesar Chavez. He fought Khan at 155, which Khan was a welterweight. Now the question is, was this a better deal? Was this a better choice? It's hard to say because we're looking at first one guy. Had this been Dimitri Bivol first or R2 Beterbiev second at 175 both, you could argue that, Canelo, who knows if he'll go back to 168 or not, but we know he's going back to 168 because he's fighting a guy that he's already drew against and beat. Okay, not by much, but he still won the second fight by decision. He had a draw in the first fight. Everyone knows I think Golovkin edged him in the first fight. However, he's going back to fight Golovkin, a 40-year-old Golovkin, a Golovkin that, yeah, he's tough, but he looked older, he looked slower, and most importantly, he looked vulnerable, okay? Meanwhile, we have Jermall Charlo, undefeated Jermall Charlo. Had some decent fights, nothing big, nothing really star-landing. He's on Showtime regular, so he's not even a pay-per-view star. So you got to take that and put it in the pot and stir it. Then you have David Benavidez, and, the narrative is that Canelo was ducking him, but then Canelo, only went to 168 because he knew he wasn't champion. It sounds convenient because he wasn't champion when Canelo was fighting there. So how do you prove that? You don't. Because you could say, how did David Benavidez lose his belt? He lost it outside the ring. I mean, it's his fault, but he lost it outside the ring. He didn't lose it inside the ring. So it's kind of hard to say on that one. Now, Errol Spence. Now, Errol Spence is a fight that I think that's why it was the highest, 55 million. He was offered 50 million to fight Caleb Plant for the last piece of the 168-pound title. But then, Errol Spence, you could argue he has other fish to fry, but then who would give Errol Spence flack for fighting Canelo? Nobody. Nobody would. In fact, people would say Errol Spence did the right move. I mean, this is really about, it's not about bashing anybody. Because I think what Canelo wanted is the same thing he wanted from Golden Boy. He wanted the right to choose what he wanted to do from fight to fight basis. But then again, was Dimitri Bivol, and especially Gennady Golovkin, something that he chose to do on a fight-by-fight basis? I don't think it was. I think he just chose the best set to him. Now, either one that he chose, he was going to be damned if he did and damned if he didn't. Why? Because if he would have chose to fight, Errol Spence, Jermall Charlo, or Benavidez at 168, the first thing people would have said was, well, why did you beat old ass Kovalev at 175 and not fight the other champions there, like Bivol, like Beterbiev? And I'm still on Beterbiev. Like, why didn't you fight that guy? Why didn't you fight a guy that's undefeated, not a guy that got knocked out by another Alverez and Andre Ward, beaten twice, mind you? Right? So, people are going to talk anyway. It's going to happen, people. That's going to happen with Canelo Alvarez. You can't fight everyone. Now, I do agree with Canelo. It's like, you motherfuckers need to start fighting each other to make each other relevant. How about this? How about Jermall fight David Benavidez? They were into it the other day, right? You guys remember that. They were in each other's shit the other day at a fight. But no one's signing the fight. Everybody's after one freaking guy. Like, hey, get the redhead. Rated R. Starts Friday. Right? But none of these guys are fighting each other. You're woofing, you're beefing, you're smack talking, you're chest bumping, you're doing all this. But none of these guys are fighting each other. So at what point it's like, okay, well, Canelo is only one guy. He can only fight one person at a time. Now, is it the lesser opposition? I don't really know. I mean, on that Canelo issue, I think it was. I mean, Gennady Golovkin issue, I think it was. But Bivol is an undefeated, bigger fighter. Ask yourself this question, okay, before I jump off of here. AR. What do you think Dimitri Bivol would do to Jermall Charlo? Better yet, how would you think Dimitri Bivol would line up against David Benavidez? How do you think Gennady Golovkin would line up against Errol Spence or Jermall Charlo? See, in any of those fights, if any of those fights that I mentioned, if they're debatable, or if there's any competition between those guys, if they have one hell of a fight, that meant that Canelo Alverez just chose to fight some of the best fighters. Because once upon a time, Gennady Golovkin was something, but doesn't mean he would be a hard guy to beat. Do you really have Jermall Charlo a shoe in at Gennady Golovkin? Not necessarily. I mean, I would pick him because he's younger. I mean, that's the issue. I would pick Jermall to beat Golovkin, but at what point? You know, that's not a set in stone alternative, you know, that he would beat Golovkin. I would pick him because, I mean, that would just be because. But who's to say that Gennady Golovkin won't go in there and land some shots to Jermall? Jermall's tough, though. But who's to say he won't be able to get past that jab? He ain't been in there with someone like Golovkin. The only person that really fought him was Canelo. You know, I think the zone is pressure him to fight him again. That's why he's ultimately fighting him instead of Beterbiev. But at the end of the day, at the very end of the day, these guys are still competitive. Gennady Golovkin not as so much, but Bivol definitely. And see what happens if Bivol this weekend beats Canelo Alvarez. What is everybody going to say then? Karma, right? He should have fought the other guy. Well, if he should have fought the other guy, he might have beat the other guy. So if this guy beats him, what do we say about his choices? Counterpunch. But anyway, you guys tell me what you think of Tom Brown saying that they offered him $100 million to take on Errol Spence at a catch weight, Jermall Charlo, and David Benavidez. Tell me what you think. Please subscribe. And you guys been Counterpunch. Peace.